Hi, welcome everyone to this week's topic, attitudes and attitude change. And I think it's fair to say that there are few topics that are so quintessential social psychological as attitudes and attitude change. Why is that so? I think about 80, 90 years ago, Alpert wanted to define social psychology as the field that is concerned only with attitudes. Attitudes were so central to research in social psychology that people felt like this is what social psychology is about, understanding the attitudes people have towards themselves and others. And if we can kind of unlock the mysteries behind them, then we will understand why people do feel and behave in the way they do. So there was a lot of promise attached to that. But before we kind of start looking at the research a little bit deeper and trying to understand that, let me start by giving you a feel for what exactly attitudes are and what the different fields are that concern themselves particularly with attitudes. So let's check our attitudes. First off, political realm in our society. If you look kind of like in the media, it's very hard to avoid this narrative that there's a growing polarization, not only in our country, but all over the world, that makes it much, much harder to cooperate with other people. So there's this idea here that we have political polarization within our society, and political polarization means there's a starker contrast between how I feel about my political party in contrast to your political party. My attitudes toward my party are somewhat becoming more and more positive, and my attitudes towards your party becoming less positive, more negative. And this contrast is called political polarization. Often Facebook and other social media companies are blamed for it, and so here's an article from The Guardian that even says, like, can we cooperate? Can we be friends with people who do not share our political ideology, the attitudes we have towards certain political questions? And the underlying idea here is that the problem of this polarization is that it kind of undermines societal cooperation. I can't even be friends. I can't work with anyone who does not exactly believe what I believe, and hence that tears apart our society. And we'll come back to that in the chapter 2 of our session today. Another one which is really at the heart of society, I think for most of us, many of us, really at the heart and the front of our heads, of our minds, is racism, stereotype, prejudice. We will talk about this in its own session. We have a dedicated session only to the topic of racism and prejudice and stereotyping. So let's leave it by that. But this research was basically grown out of research on attitudes and trying to understand why people behave so differently to members of their own race versus a different race, and trying to understand the attitudes people have towards their own race and the other races. Okay. Really important topic, and we will have that later this year as a standalone session. But there's also another one where it's like in the 80s people really cared about. It's like the attitudes you have towards yourself. Do you like yourself? Or don't you like yourself? And what do you like about yourself? What are the important aspects for your attitude towards yourself? So we will have next week a session on self and trying to better understand why people like and do not like them and which subcomponents the self is made of. But the overall evaluation of that, the self-esteem, that's an attitude that I have towards myself. And this kind of concept of self-esteem, the attitude towards myself, was highly influential for 20 plus years in social psychology, but psychology in general, and was kind of thought of, if we understand why people have trouble with their self-esteem, then we can help them to be successful and happy and less aggressive towards others. So that was like a real topic of interest in social psychology. But also, and I think this is something that still, if you go in your third year, you're taking, for instance, a module on health psychology, trying to understand the behavior people show. Why do they eat vegetables? Why don't they eat vegetables? So students, why do they sometimes come to lectures? Why don't they come to lectures? If it's in person or online. The idea was here, like, if I measure attitudes towards that behavior, then I can predict the behavior people will show. And if I change thereby this attitude, then maybe I can also change their behavior. So you see, there's like from racism to politics to self-esteem to attending lectures, all seem to be kind of tied together by attitudes. And this is why we're so interested in attitudes. This is why we're trying to better understand them. So, okay. So we have kind of like a feel. Let's kind of feel, and there's like almost the hint here, the transition. Let's try to understand what exactly attitudes are. So I think at the heart of an attitude, you can think about something where I ask you, how do you feel about something? And the something is in psychology, to make it sound a little bit more fancy, called the attitude object. So how do you feel about an attitude object? We're in social psychology. So for instance, I could try to understand how you think and feel about your here in this picture, you can, like, let's say your father, okay? So you can think like, oh, hopefully you have a very positive impression of your father. This is typical for if you're kind of young, right? Let's say like at her age, you might have a really, really positive attitude towards your father. You have a lot of, you admire him for what he does. He's so great at washing the dishes. Look at him in hand washing. Absolutely excellent. You give thumbs up. You have a very positive attitude. And then maybe you become a teenager and things become a little bit more complicated and you feel like you need a better phone and more free time and more freedom, and now you might have switched, right? So you might switch from a very positive attitude to a very negative attitude, and then you grow a little bit older, and then maybe you see like, well, my father is a person like everyone else, special to me, but there are some components that are positive, there's some components who are negative, and that then forms your attitude. So why am I telling you that? I'm telling you that because you can kind of think about an attitude not just as like one overall evaluation, but underneath the hood, so to say, there could be that you have. This should probably be on the other way around, right? You could be a very negative attitudes to something, a very positive attitude to something. You could feel ambivalent. Like in an example of your parents, you might feel like, well, my parents have some really good points and some really bad points. Overall, I love them, obviously, but there's some things I don't like. And I can show you later on in our chapters, you will see that ambivalence often plays an important role in understanding, for instance, why people behave like they do not behave. Indifference, I think, is probably something where you don't care at all about the attitude object. So hard to imagine that somebody is completely indifferent to their parents, might be, but might also not be. I think it's more likely than not that we have some kind of strong attitude towards our parents, one way or the other. But you can think about like the political realm, right? There could be somebody who has a really positive attitude towards the US president, and there could be somebody who has a very negative attitude towards Donald Trump, or it could be somebody who like says like, well, I'm in the UK, I don't care about American politics, or I don't care about politics at all. So you're indifferent, right? So you have neither a positive nor negative attitudes towards a certain attitude object, right? So this is also possible. We don't have to have an evaluation of something. We can just feel like, kind of indifferent. Who cares about politics? Especially if it's not in the UK. So there's something about this, right? We're kind of like, okay, we know now what attitudes are. They're somehow trying to capture how we feel towards something. It's a little bit more complex than just a quick evaluation. Attitudes underlie like beliefs and other society processes kind of feed into how we evaluate others. And we'll talk about that in the upcoming chapters. So, but we kind of know now what an attitude is. But why do we care so much about attitudes? And this is because of the functions we think attitudes play in our life. So if I ask you who you are, and we will talk more about this in 1 week, but if I ask you who you are, often people describe themselves in terms of their attitudes. I like this kind of music, I like that kind of food, this is what interests me, I do not like this, that's my political orientation, these are the people I'm attracted to, this is what I like in friends, and so forth. So attitudes have a real important part to play in our identity. It also shapes tremendously how we process information. So people who have low self-esteem, a low attitude towards, or a negative attitudes towards self, process compliments to them very differently than people who have a positive attitude towards themselves. So in one case, they feel like if I have low self-esteem, I might feel like you're just saying it because you have to say it. Whereas when I have high self-esteem, it's like, oh yes, I agree. We both think I'm awesome. So there's a way how we process information. You can easily think about this in in the political realm, right? If I kind of endorse a certain type of party, then I will read a certain type of newspaper, I will kind of watch a certain type of shows, and will kind of on my Facebook group have the filter set in a way that I only get the information that I want to hear. So there's a huge impact on kind of how we process information, but also on the behavior, right? If I, and that's why people in the political realm are so interested in attitudes, if I have a strong positive attitude towards a certain political candidate, then I'm more likely to vote for that person, right? So I think like, oh, person X is really great for the country. I think I have a really strong, good, positive feeling about her. I will vote for her as the next prime minister. So there's a real tight connection. So we thought for a very long time, and we will have a chapter on this today as well, between the attitudes we have and the behavior we show. We can kind of summarize it if you think about it a little bit like as the ABC of attitudes, right? There's an affective component. Do I like you? Do I not like you? There's a behavior component. If I like you, then I'm more likely to invite you to have a chat with me, to have a coffee with me. There's also a cognitive component, right? If I like you, then I'm more interested in what you have to say, to understand your perspective and listen to your concerns. So there's an affective, a behavior, and a cognition component to attitudes, and you can kind of summarize that as the ABC of attitudes. So let's see what we are doing today, right? If you kind of Google on you, or if you're on YouTube and look for attitudes, there are kind of like these two different topics who come up. It's like, oh, your attitude is everything, and the power of attitude, okay? So there's one kind of set of motivational videos who try to tell you it's all about your attitude. This is why the attitude is so important. And this will be our first part, where we kind of care about what exactly an attitude is, how we can measure it, what is our attitude, what is my attitude towards a certain object, and then why is it so powerful? Why are these people claiming that it's so powerful? And the other one is like, and that's our second part here, is how you can change your attitude, right? How to change your attitude and transform your life. So this is kind of like we were supposed to change our attitudes in order to change our lives. So we kind of see if that actually works like that in the second part, and how easy it is to change our behavior. So we have these two parts. We have the first one trying to better understand what attitudes are. And once we do that, we're trying to look at how we can change attitudes, okay? So the first part here again, how are attitudes measured? We will have that in the next video. Then how are they formed, and how are they linked to behavior? And then we have a whole second part that is all about persuasion and attitude change. So be excited and look forward to what is coming next.